Well, hello, welcome to our continuing devotional through the book of Second Timothy. We're currently Second Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 6, where Paul begins to uh, give his primary encouragement to his protege Timothy as he ministers in a distant location. Here's what he says here. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. What he's talking about here is Timothy is called to be a proclaimer of truth, a leader in the churches, and that is a gifting, a calling, an enabling that God has given him. And Paul says this was through the laying on of my hands. Now, there's debate about whether Paul actually kind of transferred that gift to him through laying on his hands, or more, I think more likely, that Paul recognized that gift and that calling upon God and kind of ordained him and for that position in the ancient way by laying on of hands, saying this is a recognition, kind of an inauguration into his ministry. But what I want you to focus on is that Paul tells Timothy, fan into flame the gift of God. In other words, it's like a fire that's been kindled needs oxygen pouring in so that it becomes even greater and bigger. And what he's saying is God has given you a gift. And this is true of all the gifts of God, but you need to now let that gift grow. You need to use it. You need to encourage it. You need to strengthen it. Even as I, as a pastor and a teacher, God gave me an ability to do that. But I don't just simply say, open up the Bible and there it is. I have to study. I have to pray. I have to meditate. I have to continually seek out ways that gift can grow, to fan into flame the gift of God. And that's what Paul's telling Timothy, not to hide it, not to let it diminish, not to let it dwindle, but to fan it into flame. And particularly, Paul's telling Timothy to go public, not to allow timidity and fear to kind of keep him reined in, because that was one of the things that Timothy struggled with. Is he was a shy person. He was an introvert. And so for him to be open in public was a very difficult thing. But Paul tells him in verse 7, for God gave us for God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control. And what he's saying here is, Timothy, that fear, that timidity, that shyness that you're experiencing, that's not something God's put into you. That's something you're going to have to overcome. What God has given you is power. And love for others is going to compel you to speak out. And love for God is going to compel you to follow his leading. And self-control. Self-control means not that you don't have fear, not that you don't have timidity, but it means it doesn't control you. Rather, you go past that in the empowerment of God to proclaim the truth. And this is really true of almost every kind of ministry, that we have to overcome something and usually parts of our own personality, that are contrary to that in order to speak out. I have had to do that in my life. I'm naturally an introverted person, and it was a real challenge, particularly the early stages of ministry, to speak publicly, to even pray publicly. Was every time I got knots in my stomach, was afraid to do it. And there's a whole story behind that I don't have time to go into right now, but I do understand where Paul's coming through here. And you have to encourage people. That's not of God. God did not give us fear, but of love and power and self-control. Therefore, he goes on to say in verse 8, therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but share in the suffering for the gospel by the power of God. Part of Timothy's timidity was not kind of that same kind of shyness or introvert personality we might think of today. In Timothy's day, to speak out for Jesus meant you might get beaten, arrested, imprisoned, or even killed. It certainly meant you were going to be rejected by friends and family and by the culture as a whole. And that has an impact. We all want to be liked. We all want to be approved. But Paul tells Timothy, and he would tell us today in our culture currently rejects Jesus also, and he would tell us, do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord. And Paul tells Timothy, don't be ashamed of me, his prisoner, but share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. He said, instead of running from it, embrace it. Hold on to it. You can do that, not in your own power, but by the power of God. Now, why would somebody be willing to go through such lengths even to be arrested, beaten, imprisoned, or put to death? We're going to talk about that, and starting in the next verse by reminding us of what God has done for us and his power at work within us. But for now, I hope you'll consider these things. We'll pick it up at verse 9 in our next devotional. Have a blessed day.